Okay, good. I want to introduce to you Patrick Bauer. And Patrick, if you want to put your camera on, that's fine. If you're camera shy,
Yeah.
that's fine too.
No, I've been trying to put up my camera. It's not working, unfortunately.
Okay, okay. I assure you though, he's wildly handsome. You can think of like a young Tom Cruise, maybe Brad Pitt, just kind of, if you can blind those two together, you've got Patrick. I also want to welcome Patrick to his first ever ISF presentation. Now, I've known Patrick for a large number of years from our involvement with the Institute of Business Forecasting. And I want to point out that in 2012, Patrick was the initial recipient of IBF's annual Excellence in Forecasting Award. So Patrick, please take over.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are in the world. I'm delighted to be here. Everyone puts up a background slide, and I've been in supply chain, and actually, if you go back further, I was a systems geek for many years before I became a supply chain geek. I discovered S&OP in the mid 90s, around 1995, while doing a project with Numetrics. For those who go back far enough. And we were putting up a S&OP pilot at Michelin, among all places. And I caught the bug. And since then, I've been a bit of an S&OP nerd, trying to digest and write about everything I see and experience inside of S&OP. So today's discussion is really about strategic S&OP. I'm going to talk a little bit for a few moments about S&OP, some definitions, maturity model, graphic representations. It's a bit of a confusing lot out there. I'll talk a little bit about what's not and what is it really. And I have a model to contemplate that's a little bit broader than the multi-step approach that most people have. And then really part of this conversation is really about connecting to an organizational strategy. And I think one of the biggest challenges people have that are S&OP practitioners is finding where the strategy in our organization exists. Some metrics of success, and then of course some final thoughts. I put the graphic on the bottom right here up. I thought it was really, really instructive, and you'll see it come together in the conversation we're going to have. I think all strategy begins with a vision. You have to have some sort of set of business objectives. We want to grow in this channel, in this marketplace, with this consumer. So most S&OP processes drive off of the business objectives or the corporate vision, and those get distilled down into strategies. And then from there into tactics, there's rules of engagement, there's metrics to make sure that you're hopefully on track. But this is a very, very simple strategic model. And to explain a little bit better, when I was a young man, I wanted to be an astronaut. That was my vision. My strategy was based on data and data acquisition. When I found out that every astronaut was a military pilot. So I said, okay, I have to be a military pilot. I found out a lot of them were service academy graduates. So I said, okay, well, that's probably my path to becoming a pilot. So let me figure out how to become a service academy graduate. Those are my broad theme strategies. And the tactics were, well, okay, to be an academy, to get into the academy, you have to be a pretty good athlete, physically fit. So I set forth on that. You have to have good SATs. You had at that point in time, 1400 was sort of the make or break. So you really had to push against that. And all of those would lead to a theoretical desired outcome. Now, as it turned out, I'm colorblind, so my ability to fly a military aircraft got stopped somewhere in the middle of the tactics when I had my physical exam for the academy. But long story short, that vision converted into strategy, into specific tactics, and I was testing myself along the way about whether I would meet the standard by which the academy would require so I could eventually become an astronaut. All this applies in the business world. This is a business strategic model you're seeing on the lower right-hand side. So a little bit of a pullback to what's this S&OP thing. A lot of people use very grand and glorious words to describe S&OP. For me, it's developing and aligning on a reality-based mid to long-term demand plan. It's coordinating the impacts of the product portfolio across the supply chain. This is new products. It's those that are mature that you're trying to promote. It's those that you're going to skew rat off. And then you're using the demand and product plans to identify risks and opportunities inside of the supply plan, inside of your capacity basis. And then you're going to assign a value to whatever your proposed plan is coming out of the first three steps, or any alternate plans or sourcing options. And then you're going to communicate and gain agreement. Now it's pretty simple when you sort of distill it down to this. Now, again, people will put very grandiose themes and words inside of this, but this is kind of what it is, everyday practitioner. The problem that we have with S&OP is it's often confusing. There's a ton of graphical metaphors. People call it different things. Frankly, I don't care what people call it. I just don't think that most of the differentiations that people have put out there really are different than what was baseline S&OP. Different meeting names, different measures of process maturity. I've seen up to 11 steps outlined and described in S&OP. There's all differing scopes and cadence, whether it's inside out or outside in. I'm partial a little bit to the Oliver White model because I went through their Train the Trainer. For me, I believe that there's probably 5 really strong defined steps, but I'm not so parochial that I believe that these are the steps that you always have to have a mature process that works for your business. When you start looking at the graphical representations, you start getting a headache. This was just the results of a simple Google search on all the graphical representations of S&OP. And if you start looking at all the different maturity models, they have all different ways to talk about stages and maturities that likewise will give you some amount of a headache. So the S&OP space, even from a practitioner who's learned in the conversation around S&OP, it's a bit of a headache at times. There isn't really a standard convention that's been defined that's not particularly clean. It makes talking about S&OP that much more difficult. And one person's version of S&OP and the relative maturity is going to be completely different than another. So I keep on coming back to this really simple model, this really simple approach. And it may be overly simplistic, but it's one of those things that as a practitioner has worked particularly well for me. When I've been asked to lay out something that's both a graphical model and a description, I always start with a portfolio review, discussion of all product lifecycle changes at demand, review, which is a complete dissection of demand, the supply review, which is really asking the question, can we make it? The pre-S&OP, which is really the value of the plans. And this is where things like FP&A start to slide in. And then the executive review, which is kind of alignment, agreement, and go. So, and if you orchestrate them in a series of meetings, it kind of looks like the graphic on the bottom. And again, this is how, when I've been pushed. So I'm not taking anyone else's content or graphical metaphors or whatever. This is how I sort of lay it out. So that's kind of how we meet. It's what it's about. It's kind of the simplistic. And the challenge that we have is there's this push to make S&OP strategic. And one of the notions of IBP is that IBP is a more mature and even more strategic version of S&OP. Now, I'll argue that those proponents are right and not right at the same time. IBP is by definition everything I've ever seen, kind of baseline S&OP. what it really speaks to is the relative maturity of S&OP. So how do you make S&OP more mature? And making it more mature, in my mind, makes it more strategic. So maturity really pivots around 5 key concepts: executive participation, making sure that the topical material inside the meeting is executive and strategic level, having a long range view, bringing in the financial evaluation component, and then making sure that if there's strategic projects that impact supply and demand, that they're otherwise talked about inside of the S&OP meeting. These, when you start reading through all the literature, and this is where the S&OP nerd in me comes in. If you read through the literature, these are the 5 bullet points that you'll almost always see inside of it. I'm not sure people describe them enough, so I've matured the description of them in a little deeper dive here. So executive engagement means they're active participants in the process. When I worked at Snapple, the CEO of Snapple would walk into my office the day before the S&OP executive review, and he'd say, how do I participate? What do I need to know? What type of decisions will I need to be making? He wanted to be fully engaged in the process. He showed up. He was at every meeting. He was engaged. He read all the materials. He helps it clarify. You serve the clarification and facilitation role inside the meetings. And then he helped facilitate decision making. We also talked about what type of topics should be brought in to the meeting. And a lot of times S&OP executive reviews are very, very reporting out. Here's our plan. Here's what it means. And they're boring and humdrum. And they're not often a lot of decision making. Sometimes somewhere in the prior discussions or sub meetings, someone had already made a decision, and decisions weren't necessarily being brought to the meeting. Executives as sponsors of S&OP plus the facilitator of S&OP needs to make sure that there's a decision or 2 that are made inside the meeting. A list of decisions that can be served up can be long range, tactical, or retrospective. Retrospectives are kind of like, I'm informing you of something that happened and here's how we reacted. Tactical is rarely talked about, but there's actually a lot of tactical decisions that happen inside of an S&OP meeting. Expedite this or that for one reason or another, but usually it's because the dollar value of the tactical decision merits consideration. For me, if it was over $100,000 in inventory or spend that I'd have to put into it, I would make sure tactical decisions rose into the executive review. Not every decision is long range, even though people like to talk about S&OP being long range. Tactical decisions are very common, and this is a place where you can bring tactical decisions in. If you bring tactical decisions in, you are bringing decision making into the meeting, which makes it by its nature more strategic. Executive topics and metrics are aligned to known strategic initiatives, and we'll talk about that in a second. For example, can SKU rationalization, a pretty tactical exercise, be a strategic initiative? And yes, when you start looking at what Coca-Cola and P&G have said about SKU rationalization in the post-COVID world, they are definitely conversations that are strategic initiatives, but very tactical in their everyday existence. And I always say yes if it's a stated goal of the organization. So I'll show you a couple of examples. Financial impacts usually are supported by an FP&A process. One of the biggest gaps I've seen in S&OP process in general is that there's a lack of valuation on the plans, agreed plans, alternate plans, gap closers. There's a lack of money. There's dollar signs that are missing in the conversation, and it's tremendously important that dollar signs come forward. When you start talking at an executive level, Most of the conversation is around dollar impacts, whether it's top line or bottom line. Again, bringing in more FP&A analysis helps push the S&OP process to be more strategic. And of course, projects that influence demand, supply, or finance and are strategic in nature should be discussed during S&OP, mostly if they're falling off track. I have seen ERP implementations be part of an S&OP conversation, and specifically how they were tracking relative to the timeline. And of course, what really makes S&OP more strategic is pulling in those metrics, those outcomes that I described in the prior slide, in one of the earlier slides. You want to measure those outcomes and see if you're on plan or not. So where do you find strategy? And this has been one of those things that's the eureka moment for a lot of people. I'll have someone come up to me, after a conference and say, "Hey, listen, would you mind taking a phone call? Can we talk about my S&OP process a bit?" And one of the questions I ask is, how strategic is it? And they'll say, "Well, we don't talk about everything I just illustrated on the prior slide." And I asked them whether they're participant in, if it's a CPG company, as an example, in brand review meetings where products, pricing, channels, promotions, and media spend, all demand influencing, demand shaping events are talked about. And they'll say, "No, I'm not." Same thing with sales review meetings where products and customers, pricing per customer, channel development, tactical promotions, media spend by channel, all of these demand shaping activities are discussed, and they'll say no. Similarly, they're not involved in the operational review meetings where capacity and network changes, distribution and freight choices and production changes are discussed. We often leave our S&OP facilitators and leads out of these important discussions that are key pivotal supply and demand conversations. I have seen S&OP leaders completely left out of the budgeting process with all the assumptions that go into the next fiscal year conversation, so they can do watchouts and they can start testing. There is strategy all throughout an organization. You'll find in R&D roadmaps and even the PMOs of most companies. And if you can't find it internally, there's a tremendous amount in both a public discourse and analyst reporting. You'll find it in 10Qs, you'll find it in public statements, you'll find it on websites. Sometimes it's in the news. Coca-Cola expands ruthless SKU rationalization strategy to cut entire product lines. I think both Coke and P&G have said they're going to cut their SKU count by 20%. It's a strategic initiative. It sounds very tactical. And on most levels it is, but it's also very strategic initiatives. And that should be part of the strategy conversation inside of S&OP. Here's an example off of the Unilever website of how, and it's a really great, if you want to dig into it, and I put the link down below. They have a great conversation on their supply chain strategy, and that supply chain strategy should have some linkage back to what they measure and their conversation inside of S&OP. Most of the top 50 consumer goods companies have some sort of conversation, especially in the post-COVID world, about, or the mid-COVID world, they have some sort of conversation around supply chain. And I think it would behoove anyone, if you work for a company, if you're in one of those top 50, or you're trying to sell into the top 50, you should go look at their 10Qs and their public pronouncements, and you'll find some really interesting conversations around this strategy, the supply chain strategy, which often doesn't cascade into the S&OP process.
Patrick, we're at 20 minutes.
Sure. So I've tried to distill S&OP and talk about it a little bit differently. Most people talk about what's shaded in blue, and those are the 5 steps. I pull it all the way back to the business objectives on the far left-hand side, and I try and break it down into what's the supply chain strategy, what's the commercial, and what's the financial strategy, and then I carry it forward. Now, looking at an example, commercial strategy usually has 2 components: the route to market and product. The product becomes part of life cycle processes like stage gate, and those eventually end up in product plans, which should be talked about in the portfolio review. Most people don't draw the connections backwards to strategy and how those strategic initiatives and sub processes come forward into S&OP. And they come forward into the planning stack, that area in yellow. These are the everyday tactics and work product of most of the supply chain and demand planning parts of an organization. And if you sort of go back to my original graphic, there's a vision, a connected strategy, and then the tactics. The tactics exist inside of somewhere between that lighter orange and yellow. It's how am I going to execute against these strategies? What are the product lifecycle processes I need to address? And then how do they convert into product plans? What am I going to SKU rat off? What am I going to promote to help mature the product a little bit more, to help grow it in maturity? These are the connections and how you connect them to outcomes. And the real connection to outcomes is trying to pull in KPIs that are tied to your strategy. So I didn't put what I often call the holy trinity of metrics in here. I didn't talk about inventory because everyone talks about inventory. I didn't talk about forecast accuracy because everyone talks about it, or customer service. But there are other metrics that could tie back to your strategy. There could be consumer metrics, and whether you're growing a specific consumer cohort or a channel such as direct to consumer, which is really hot these days. There's freight metrics, especially if you're trying to really penetrate a direct to consumer and the costs associated with last mile movements. There's a ton of metrics that you can apply that tie back to some strategic initiative that's been articulated in either any of those meetings and any of the public pronouncements. So I always have a slide that's having gone through some of the content here, what can you do tomorrow? You need to tap into whatever strategic statements the organization has, specifically around supply chain, but also around markets and products and people and development. And you have to meet with your key S&OP stakeholder to get their input on what those topics, metrics, and focus should be. You want to make sure that you're aligning as much as possible the vision of the company and the business objectives to the topics and metrics and focus of the S&OP meeting. I would ask definitely, and I did in every place I've ever worked as a practitioner, to be invited into those key strategic meetings. You need to hear for yourself the direction and how they plan to execute against it. This really helps me set what metrics I need to put in place. Gradually add metrics beyond the typical inventory, service, and accuracy. And you want to start integrating key strategic discussions in the S&OP. For example, as I used before, if you're reducing SKU count as a business objective, then you need to discuss your progress against that. I personally like, and I'll tell you that the executive teams tend to like topical deep dives, and I would always work with the CEO or the president of the company on what those deep dives should be, and makes your meetings feel more strategic. Sometimes I'll wrap the S&OP meeting inside of a business review discussion, so that all the commercial strategies that are being discussed inside the business review are integrated into the S&OP meeting. And you need to assign 3 values to everything that you talk about in S&OP: money, time, and impact. And you need to make sure all of those show up in your evaluations. These are the things that your executive team will start pulling you into. I always like quotable quotes, and I looked at strategy, and I found 4 quotable quotes that seem to have a lot of relevance to the conversation. And I'll leave this slide up for a moment. That's the presentation. What I always suggest is people should reach out to me on LinkedIn if you want to further the contact, or I put my email address in the presentation. Please feel free to reach out to me, and if you want to talk further on any of these topics.
Great, Patrick. Thank you very much. Love the Churchill quote.
Mm-hmm.
We have in the chat, Stefan K, if you'd like to pop up and ask it live. Although let me ask one thing first, the Snapple executive you mentioned, how rare is that?
It's it really becomes very common. Sometimes when I worked at Combe, and they made Just for Men and Vagisil, the vice president of sales was the big advocate. And he would want to know everything I was going to talk about, and he'd sit in my office and we'd talk about what was happening, trend line in the business. So it's common if you bring the engagement to the executive.
Okay, great. Stefan.
All right, thank you. You interrupted me a bit, right? All right, if I understand you correctly, Patrick, the idea is that S&OP, the entire process, should have visibility to the executives, and with the executives sitting in on the meeting. So question, there's tons of meetings or decisions that are honestly not worth their time, and you alluded to those tactical meetings, tactical decisions, you call them. So what do we do with that kind of decision? Do we take that out of that S&OP meeting? Do we have a separate meeting that we call a tactical S&OP process and meeting? And if so, who decides which decisions get escalated and which decisions are worth executive attention?
Yeah, it's a good question. And over the last number of years, probably the last 10 years, whole notion of S&OE and integrated execution have come about. To me, it's a variant of master planning, and every company I've ever worked for would have weekly or bi-weekly operational meetings where they would talk through all those tactical decisions. They were much more granular. Like, am I going to shift out of a carrier on some specific lanes because Walmart service levels aren't being met? Or should I pre-build some inventory for the next month because I have capacity shut down, next week, or I'm sorry, 2 months out. So very tactical, boring to the average executive type of discussions. Those are kind of retrospectively informed type of decisions. So.
Hey, we've got time for one more.
Yep.
I'll actually chime in if no one else has anything. These things kind of go in cycles. S&OP, I guess when it was first invented way back in the 80s or whatever, had kind of a heyday, disappeared for 10 or so years, and then kind of came back with a vengeance, maybe 2005, 2010 area. Over this time period in your career, I mean, are we getting better at it? I mean, I've seen so many attempts and failures along the way. I mean, do they really need someone like you driving it to make it work, or the average company actually make it go?
Well, I think that the ebbs and flows inside of an organization are because people treat it as a project and not as a ongoing journey. S&OP needs to be constantly being implemented. It's not a process model that you put it in like a system, like some form of automation, and that'll sustain. It needs to be constantly caressed and massaged and pushed towards success. And you'll have maturity fallbacks all the time in it. And usually it has to do with educating a key stakeholder on the importance of S&OP or the value of S&OP. So inside of an organization, it ebbs and flows all the time. It needs to be as institutionalized as you can make it. Formalized training, new stakeholder enlistment. You need to do all those right things. Sort of in the bigger scope, yeah, there's definitely ebbs and flows right now. Post-COVID, there seems to be this heavy focus on S&OE and responsiveness, and all of that is great, but it's still master planning and detail planning. It's not strategic at all, and I worry that people are going to be putting up some master planning application inside of or a what if scenario plan inside of an S&OP executive review, and it's going to further disenfranchise the executives from the conversation they need to be having. What are our long-term plans, and how do we, both on supply, demand, and products, and how do we make sure we can execute against them?
Hey, thank you, Patrick. And with that, again, welcome to your first time at the ISF. We're great to have you. Hope we'll see you around in future years.